Hello and welcome to AII Delhi's podcast Diwali special. Today we are extremely fortunate to be joined by Guru Prakash. Guru was recently made the national spokesperson for the BJP just a few months ago. He's the senior researcher and project head of the well-known think tank India Foundation and writes voluminously on socio-political issues on a freelance basis with various publications. Guru also leads the youth outreach program of the Dalit India Chamber of Commerce and Industry and is currently working with the Human Rights Defence International, a New Delhi-based NGO working for the issues of human rights concerning the Indian diaspora. Guru, it's such a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much, Tanya. It's an absolute pleasure to be speaking with Australia India Institute. And obviously, Australia as a country has been very close to my heart as an alumni of Australia India Youth Dialogue. And as a former steering committee member as well, I have had the opportunity myself to visit Melbourne, Sydney, and Cairns twice. And I absolutely love to contribute in any manner to have a better bilateral relationship. And how do we leverage the advantages in the interest of the people of both the countries. So I certainly look forward to speaking with AII.
Thank you so much. And you've spoken already about the Australia-India relations, which this year have gone from strength to strength. Australia also has a deep respect and growing interest, both not just from a personal perspective, but also an economic one with India, and increasingly a geostrategic one, as we've seen also go from strength to strength this year. However, on a state-based level, Bihar is little known, and yet this is one of the oldest states of India in terms of civilizational strengths. It has Nalanda University, arguably the oldest university in the world. And in fact, the Maurya Empire was one of India's first, the first empire of India also originated out of Bihar. Could you please introduce the state of Bihar to our Australian audience and its significance today?
No, certainly. And I think it's very critical to have a very informed perspective on Bihar. And before I start with my answers, let me tell you or caution you in advance that we have had a very important election, and the size of electorate was almost 12 crore. Our party has emerged victorious consecutively for the fourth term, and it was on many levels a very important election. It was the first important election amidst the COVID pandemic. But regardless of that, people in large numbers, people in huge numbers came out, voted, and gave a boost to the spirit of democracy. And from this spirit of democracy, I would like to speak on Bihar. You see, Bihar has been the seat of one of the most important, one of the largest empire ever recorded in the history of mankind, the Magad dynasty. So, and that Magad dynasty also would tell you about the sort of political reforms that we need today. One of the foremost strategic thinkers ever recorded in the history, Kautilya, Chanakya, he wrote Arthashastra, which is a treatise not only on economic policy, foreign policy, security, strategy, day-to-day administration, but on multiple levels. It addresses questions which a policymaker, which a person who is involved in administration or the government must have a hindsight view of. So Kautilya led Chandragupta Maurya. So Chandragupta Maurya was a boy from a socially marginalized community. He led that boy to the throne of this Magad dynasty. And by doing this, he repeatedly proved and asserted that it is not necessary that only a son of a king can become a king. Whoever has the capacity, whoever has the capability should be eligible for the throne. So in the world's largest empire ever recorded, the Magad dynasty, whose boundaries were unimaginably huge, from the present day Afghanistan to the present day east part of the country. So that is something which is very important. Apart from that, if you look at the world's oldest university, the Nalanda University, it was established in 4th century, and much before your Oxford and Cambridge was started, Nalanda International University was in existence, and we had courses on peace and conflict studies, Buddhist studies, Indic studies at that Nalanda International University, which has been sort of as a project of the government of India. It has restarted as a product of East Asia Summit in 2008, and the Ministry of External Affairs of the government of India and the government of Bihar are together working in collaboration to sort of reinstate that Nalanda International University. And today, more than 20 Southeast Asian countries have their students complete their courses here. So it is something which is really phenomenal. Bihar is historical, Bihar is spiritual, Bihar is religious, and a very important nerve center, be it your studies, be it your politics, as a birth of democracy as well. And that's also very important. The first ever recorded republic, the Lichvi dynasty, which we say, it was in 3000 BC, if I'm not mistaken. Or, no, not on 3000 BC, but 3000 years ago. I'm sorry for that. So 3000 years ago, much before the founding fathers of the US Constitution or the Westminster was declared, the people in Vaishali, they chose a republic. And that is something which is very phenomenal. So it's very important that we have a perspective from Bihar, we have a perspective on Bihar. And like I said, you could hear some movement in the background because we have just had a very important election and the people of Bihar are celebrating. Obviously, I, from the BJP as a party worker, my family has been associated with the BJP. So there is a sense of jubilant all over the home. There is a sense of renewed enthusiasm and excitement. But I look forward to answering those questions in the course of our conversation, Tanya.
Look, that's wonderful. And you've already outlined some very key points about the state of Bihar, and all very timely. Here we are on the eve of Diwali, the festival of lights, talking about, in a way, the igniter of lights. When we think about the festival celebrating the triumph of knowledge over ignorance, to think about the oldest university in the world originating from Bihar, part of that, leadership of light, if you like. You've also talked about an interesting point that I'll touch on later, this very original concept of equality of opportunity, even within India's very first empire. The idea that anyone could be king is a point I'd like to unpack later in our discussion. But for now, you've touched on the excitement and celebration in your home that's going on behind you as part of the Bihar election win, in addition to being on the eve of Diwali, I'm sure. But please tell us a little bit about the state of Bihar's election win that was very recent, why it's significant for the nation overall, and what you think impacted BJP's victory in the state of Bihar this time around. Was it to do with COVID management? What were some of the platforms that you think led to BJP's victory this year?
You see, Tanya, Bihar is home to more than 12 crore people. And any political development in Bihar is bound to have implications not only in the region, not only in the country, but it also has resonance in the Southeast Asia region as well. So it's just unimaginable. Like 12 crore people. Like it's what, double of Australia or almost 1.5 times of Australia?
We'll have to break down the number for Australia. So 1 crore is 10 million?
1 crore is 100 million.
100 million times 12 is what we're talking about.
10
yeah, that's what I
crore,
thought. So 10 million times 12. So we're talking about 120 million people?
Yeah, correct.
So this is more than 5 times Australia's population. Yes.
So just to get you a perspective, but otherwise, like I said, that it was a very monumental election as it was happening amidst the COVID pandemic. And the kudos to the Election Commission of India, which is a body, which is a constitutional body, and it required a lot of preparation. I'll tell you, because the number of booths were increased. The number of voters on a single polling booth, they were reduced. The sort of logistical requirement was just amazing. But regardless of that, the fact that Election Commission of India successfully pulled it off is something for which they deserve accolades, they deserve congratulations. At the same time, our election commission is consultant to many countries. I agree that many countries in the COVID pandemic has had their elections at the national level, at the provincial level. But having an election in Bihar is something which is a very difficult, at the same time, a very interesting proposition. So we have to have some special mention, some sense of gratitude to the Election Commission of India, which is a constitutional authority. But at the same time, the people of Bihar came out of their homes in this hour of pandemic and participated in the democratic process in a large number. That again is something which is very interesting. The voting percentage, let me tell you, was higher than the last election. Although
Wow.
marginally higher, but it was still higher than the last election. Another interesting takeaway was that the number of female voters were much higher than the number of male voters. There was almost a 5 to 6% difference between the number of female voters and the number of male voters. So,
Just on this
and
point, I actually want to really congratulate Bihar for this. AII has worked closely with the Electoral Commission of India, and one of the points they made was one of safety, and that decades ago it was actually challenging for women to vote in the state of Bihar because of risk to life and fear of actually getting to the polls. But now security and safety has been a real priority, and it's really allowed women equal participation in democracy. And as you're saying, even a greater demographic uptake and participation in democracy than ever before.
yeah, so Bihar was the first state ever in the history of India to have reservation for women in the local self-government, which is the third tier of governance, the panchayats. In 2006, through Bihar Panchayati Raj Act, Bihar became the first state to do so. And that's very important because Bihar is land of goddess Sita. Bihar is land of Ubhay Bharti. Ubhay Bharti was someone who challenged the then Shankaracharya, Adi Shankaracharya, for a debate, and she ensured that in a debate, in a Shastrarth, she emerged victorious. So at that level, Bihar is very important. Bihar is very significant when it comes to women empowerment. But especially, I would like to speak of some of the excellent policy measures by our government at the central level and at the state level as well. You know, as the pandemic started, there were challenges, and you would appreciate that this pandemic was unimaginable, unprecedented at many levels. But the way the Honorable Prime Minister has handled this crisis, it deserves to be mentioned here. Being mindful of the economic implications of imposing a lockdown, regardless, he imposed that lockdown. And now that decision of imposing a lockdown is being praised by international agencies and organizations like Indian Council of Medical Research as well. So that is something which is commendable. In terms of health diplomacy, you have written extensively about it. And I remember reading your article that how India emerged as a sort of pivot when it comes to health democracy. And that would define the role in shaping the post-COVID world order, when there is a certain amount of skepticism about some of our neighbors, and how India, as a robust democracy, how India, with a very powerful demographic dividend, stands to sort of leverage in this international atmosphere. So even then, even in this hour of crisis, our Prime Minister ensured that free ration, 5 kg of rice, 5 kg of pulses, and 1 kg of nuts, it is delivered to each and every person till the festival of Chhat. Chhat again is a very important festival of Bihar, which happens 6 days after Diwali. This year it's going to happen on 20th of this month. So till the festival of Chhat, the Honorable Prime Minister of India ensured that no one goes to the bed hungry in the night. Everyone gets something to eat, even in this difficult time. That was something which was done by the central government. Apart from that, the JAM Trinity, the Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, and the Mudra, the JAM scheme, is ensured to end the financial untouchability. The way women were out of the financial net, they were out of the financial umbrella. Through the scheme of Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, it was ensured, and I'll tell you, I have data for this, that more than 2.5 crore accounts of women have been opened in Bihar through Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana. They are constantly receiving direct benefit transfer of 1500 rupees per month to ensure that everyone in their family are sufficiently fed. They are getting benefits of the Mudra scheme to ensure that they get to do some startup on their own. There are schemes like the self-help group as well, where the World Bank of India has supported the government of Bihar in making more than 1.5 crore women self-dependent through
Mhm.
entrepreneurship. They're making the Madhubani painting masks and different type of masks. So how do you make them self-reliant when it comes to survival or not? So that is the reason some amount of history, which I said, some amount of central welfare policy measures, and some amount of international cooperation, and the state government's foresight in reaching out to the women and ensuring that they're helped on a regular basis, helped us get their support for the last 15 years. And this time as well, they have supported us, and we continue to retain their support in the future as well.
No, that's incredibly comprehensive. And I think to talk about the social welfare element really brings home also the importance of understanding just that there is a lot of poverty also still in India, and the importance of feeding people directly is actually a crucial part of humanity and a humanity response. Given you've touched on a number of human rights issues, including poverty, hunger, gender equality, and access to finance, you spoke also about financial untouchability, which I thought was quite an interesting turn of phrase, because often women or parts of the community are locked out of access to loans or even small loans to start their own businesses, which then also has an impact on whether you can economically develop. Given your own work on the Dalit community, I just wondered if you could touch on equality within India in terms of the caste system as well, given your work there. This is something lesser known in Australia because it's not something that our country is based on, but it's still a very important issue within India. Could you talk a little bit about your work, what Dalit means, and then also why this is important work for the foundation of India as well?
Certainly, certainly. And I think, you know, people who are inimical to the interest of country against the idea of India, against the interest, against the national interest, they usually try to spread the falsehood against issues of caste, against issues of community. But we, you asked, who are Dalits? So Dalits essentially are people who belong to socially disadvantaged communities in our social structure. But having said that, in the course of last 7 decades of our independence, the makers of our constitution, who were really visionary people and people with great vision and foresight, the chairperson of the drafting committee of the Indian Constitution, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar himself, came from the so-called erstwhile untouchable community, and in the present parlance we call Dalit community. So because of some interventions in the course of our history, the system was worth based, not birth based. But in the course of the last 700, 800, 900 years, when we were constantly being invaded by Islamist forces, we are constantly being invaded by the imperialist forces from the Western Europe countries as well, there was a sort of anomaly that was created. I cannot give you the exact timeline, but I can say this with full authority that a certain segment of our population were bereft from the advantages of the structures of power, property, and prestige. So there has been a long-ranging movement for the cause of the subaltern, for the cause of the disadvantaged. So around the 1970s and 80s, the term Dalit became a popular term for them, which denotes a group of such communities who have historically been marginalized. But at the same time, as the country got the independence and the chairperson of the drafting committee of the Constitution of India, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, drafted a visionary constitution, one of the lengthiest constitution, as you would know, made some special provisions for preferential treatment in education and employment for people coming from marginalized communities or people coming from the Dalit community. Much of water has gone down the bridge. It has been 7 decades. People have benefited of these policies of affirmative action. At the same time, there are some important challenges as well, which keeps on coming now and then. So, Dalit Indian Chamber of Commerce, you asked like about the role of the organization,
Sure.
is a network, is a group of entrepreneurs coming from the scheduled caste, the constitutional term for Dalits, and the scheduled tribe communities, people who have been geographically excluded. If you combine both SCs and STs, it comes to around 23% of the Indian population. And again, I would not go to the numbers, what would 23% of 1.4 billion mean? But that again is a huge chunk. And there is a sort of churning going on in that community. What is going to be the next generation of reforms? What are going to be the next generation of demands? Has affirmative action in the constitution served its purpose, or we need for a longer time? These are some of the important questions which the community is facing today, and I'm sure people from the community in the course of last 7 decades have become mature enough to deal with these questions. So as far as the question on DICCI, the Dalit Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry is concerned, let me tell you that it was created in 2005. It was intended to be a collective of entrepreneurs, small scale and large. Some of them also have a turnover of more than 1,000 crore. So it's accumulative. It's a group of almost 10,000 entrepreneurs coming essentially from SC/ST categories from across the country. The idea was to have a network. The idea was to support young entrepreneurs coming from Dalit category, young entrepreneurs coming from the tribal community. So that was the idea, to create a solid network so that you can leverage that network. You can do some hand holding, provide some support, and create new entrepreneurs. Because, like I said, the constitutional mode of affirmative action in terms of education and employment, with the 1991 economic reforms, the country saw liberalization, privatization, globalization. So how do Dalits and tribals, people from the marginalized community, become an important stakeholder in the growth story of the country? That's very important. So DICCI, Dalit Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, under the leadership of visionary Mr. Milind Kamble, who himself comes from this category, needless to say, intends to have that support and network to further create more jobs and opportunities for people coming from these communities. It is also important because the slogan which on which Dicky comes, the philosophy on which it was created, was be job givers, not job seekers. Because initially, before DICCI, before the era of liberalization, privatization, globalization, our people were restricted in terms of perspective when it came to employment. The only option was government job, but now there are options opening up. And let me also tell you that in the last 6 years, the government of India, under the visionary leadership of Honorable Prime Minister, have ensured that the youngsters from the Dalit community become self-reliant, become entrepreneurs. There are some excellent schemes. Obviously, you are aware of Mudra scheme. There is one scheme completely dedicated to the Dalit youngsters and the tribal youngsters. That is the Stand Up India scheme. Under the Stand Up India scheme, I'll briefly tell you that there are 1.25 lakh public sector branches. Each branch is supposed to support and handhold entrepreneurs from two categories, one Dalit and one woman. So by doing this, in the course of a couple of years, you would see more than 5 lakh, 6 lakh entrepreneurs coming from this category with the support of the government. So this is in a nutshell what the idea of the Dalit consciousness has been, the trajectory of since the constitutional revolution, and now to some positive intervention in the field of entrepreneurship and economy. Anya.
No, it's really great to hear your description of um, affirmative action and support for a community that had been marginalized. Obviously, Gandhi had done a bit of work for the Dalit community by, I think, coming up with the term Dalit. Ambedkar, who you mentioned, has gone to extraordinary lengths to really lift the concept of equality. And I find that this relates very strongly even to the philosophy that you started with at the beginning of this interview from the Maurya Empire, that your future should not be dictated to by your birth. The importance of equity and opportunity is paramount. So wonderful to hear that you're keeping this philosophy alive in your own work, in politics as well as in your intellectual work. Obviously, you're a well-known intellectual within India as well, with your work in the India Foundation, and I believe working on your PhD also. You touched on self-reliance for Dalits and becoming employers rather than employees, starting their own businesses. Now that you've also become a national spokesperson for the BJP, could you also share with us your concept of Atmanirbhar Bharat, or self-reliance at a national level? Obviously, within other countries across the world, part of the reaction or response to COVID has been to create stronger senses of national self-reliance, and India has its own brand. However, from many of Modi's presentations, Prime Minister Modi's presentations, it seems that this goes hand in hand with a strong sense of globalization, or a human-centric globalization as well. Could you tease out a little bit for us the concept of Atmanirbhar Bharat and its link to the world or to globalization as India sees it?
That's too many questions. No, but I'll break it down for you. So Mahatma Gandhi once said that the earth provides enough to satisfy everyone's need, but not everyone's greed. Thus, practice of consumerism, crass consumerism, propagated by West to support a certain section of market forces and so on. So India, since its inception, has been very ecological in its thinking. Environmental sustainability, as propagated by a section of Western academia, in terms of India, our thinking is such that you would have yourself felt that in South India we use the banana leaf to as our plates. So look at how sustainable everything is. Even in Bihar, we use that dry leaves. So we make a plate of dry leaves. I don't have it right now, but I would have shown you. We have clay cups for tea as well. So by giving you these examples, I'm sort of telling you that how everything was well in sync. Even our festivals have some scientific background. When we say that we celebrate Diwali, when we light the diya, it is to attract some positive energy. It is the end of a season. The season in Indian calendar is of Sharad Ritu, and it is expected that there are going to be some insect, and it is the darkest day of the year. Let me tell you. So why do we light diyas on the day of Diwali? It is the darkest. It is supposed to be the darkest day, one of the darkest days of the year. So the light of diya is such that anyone who is living across does not get a sense of alienation, does not get a sense of darkness. Having said that, I would say that when our honorable Prime Minister speak of Atmanirbhar Bharat at multiple levels, in one of his recent speeches, he asked or appealed the youngsters of India to also get active in politics, get active in political activism. But when it comes to Atmanirbhar Bharat, we have to build of something of our own for our own people, but at the same time being mindful of the fact that there is a sort of integration globally. When the COVID pandemic struck the world, hydroxychloroquine, paracetamol, PPE kits, you won't believe we were exporting all of it. There was a time when we were sort of at the receiving end, but we made ourselves self-sufficient and we started exporting all of it. That was a rare example of Atmanirbhar Bharat. Only yesterday, the Honorable Finance Minister of the country came out with this Atmanirbhar Package 3. So the government has a vision, has an action plan and a strategy in mind of how do we emerge out of this COVID struck economy. How do we sort of increase the demand in the market? How do we maintain the level of liquidity in the market? And at the same time, support homegrown entrepreneurs and homegrown ideas. In the last 6 years, people from different communities, and I can tell you this, that the women folks, the SCs, the ST, the socially backward communities, they have came out and supported the idea of entrepreneurship in large numbers. There are people in Gujarat, people in Bihar, people in Uttar Pradesh who wants to create something of their own. Indians have this inherent talent. We come together, we have a sense of tradition, we have a sense of family, and there are hundreds of such examples. be it your Lijjat Papad, the Amul Mill, which started as a family enterprise but ended up being huge cooperatives and subsequently large corporations. So the focus is going to be stay rooted. And what are the sort of ideas that can inspire us in our vision to be Atmanirbhar. So on that policy front, I would say that when you ask a question about human-centric globalization, our Prime Minister often says that we believe in the principles of Antyodaya. Antyodaya is a principle where we focus on the last man standing in the line. Whenever we make any policy, whenever we do any policy analysis, that last man in the line should be at the center of our imagination. So every policy, every move of the government has to keep in mind the concerns, the challenges, and the aspirations of that last man in the line. And this is our thinking in terms of domestic policy making. And this is what we mean, to my mind, the human-centric globalization as well.
No, that's wonderful, and you've touched on a few points there. You mentioned medicines and pharmaceuticals and the exporting that India was able to do, particularly early on in the COVID pandemic. What struck me also was that in the early days, I think around March, India was a net importer of PPE as well, the personal protection equipment, like gloves and masks and things that were needed to prevent against COVID, and became just 2 months later a net exporter of PPE as well. So that investment in local production can indeed then go on to help the world. And I know that many countries across the world were beneficiaries of Indian exports of pharmaceuticals at that time. You've also then touched on the humanity aspect as well, which is really key. I really thank you for your time today on such an auspicious day, not only the eve of Diwali, celebrating, light and knowledge and humanity, which also touched on the last man in the line, as you said, but also on your fabulous electoral win
Or a
in Bihar.
last person on the line. It could be a man or a woman, anyone. The last person on the line. Sorry.
No, well pointed out, because it's certainly a philosophy that is sometimes difficult to comprehend across the nation. And this is certainly something that has been said. For example, India's unwillingness at the time to join RCEP is because the mentality at a policy level is to think about the bottom 300 million and whether they will be affected, not just the top 300 million and whether they will benefit. And I think that this is an important philosophy to balance and keep in mind when thinking about Indian foreign policy as well. So it's been a pleasure to speak with you as always, Guru. I wish you a wonderful Diwali celebration and your family as well. Very deserved after your electoral win this week as well. So congratulations and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Thank you so much to the entire team of AII. And I again apologize for some sort of background disturbances that would have come in. But
no, it
I really look
adds to the festivities.
Yeah, I mean, combined festivities, Diwali, our electoral victory, people reposing faith in us, people reposing faith in the leadership. That is something, it is actually Jan Ashirwad. So when we say Jan Ashirwad, it's the blessings of the people. In a people-led system, in a people-led governance, in a democracy, it is the people who are supreme. So we are actually blessed to have their blessings. And it was
Indeed.
really wonderful talking to you, Tanya. I look forward to be with you at AII as well. And in any cause, in any manner, if I can contribute to the betterment of industrial relationship, I'm always available.
Thank you. And I just want to throw in a huge thank you to Muskan Jain from our team, who also joined us on this day of Diwali to help us record this session. So a big thank you and shout out to Muskan from the AII Delhi team as well. And thank you very much, Guru. I'm sure we'll be in touch.